And that brings us to our continuing series, Obama and the World. It has been a year since the president took office, and though he named former Senator Mitchell as special envoy to the region, little progress seems to have been made in the peace process. To discuss the situation there in much more detail, we are joined tonight from Washington by Daniel Levy and Amjad Atallah. They are the co-directors of the Middle East Task Force at the New America Foundation. And gentlemen, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Let's start just to ask if you would remind us, what has the Obama administration done in the past year to try to move the peace process forward? Daniel?
Well, first of all, we had engagement right from the beginning on day one, including with Syria, which was something new. We had a special envoy appointed, Senator George Mitchell. The president gave a very important speech in Cairo. The administration made this a priority, and perhaps most importantly, they articulated a position which understood that Middle East peace, resolving Israel-Palestine, is central to American strategic interests because they appreciate the impact this has on everything else America is trying to do in the region because of the resonance, the iconoclastic status of the Palestinian issue. Having done all that, they then went about trying to advance peace in incredibly orthodox ways, trying to do things that had failed for more than a decade and trying to perhaps do them better.
Basically, why have things not worked out better given all of this?
Well, I mean, I think Daniel put his finger on it. They articulated a new position. They didn't implement a new policy. And so the problem was that they created all these new expectations based on the articulation of this grand new vision that, in fact, was very, very pro-American, very, very American-centric and American-focused, which is exactly what it needed to be. But then they began to try to implement the Bush administration-era policy on the issue. And the two big places where they didn't try to make any changes at all, but they needed to, where one was on the question of the style of negotiations. They attempted simply to go back into the Annapolis process. The second part of it was Gaza. The Bush administration had actually worked very hard to separate the West Bank from the Gaza Strip politically and to isolate Gaza and to implement a siege on Gaza. Now, President Obama articulated clearly on several occasions that this was not the U.S. policy and this needed to change. But in 1 year's time, we haven't been able to see any change on those two fronts.
There's speculation out here, actually out in the realm of news, that recently these peace talks are about to resume. I'm wondering, have either one of you heard that? Do you believe it?
Well, there is certainly a lot of speculation in the region, here in the United States, that an effort that has been going on for several months now will bear fruit. What you'll also see, though, Martin, is that no one really thinks that this is going to get you anywhere. And the real concern is that we will be back in a relatively meaningless negotiation process, which ends up undermining the parties involved in the negotiations, undermining the cause of peace, and not really addressing America's need in advancing this. I think the other thing to point out, though, is we don't yet have a particular policy approach to moving peace forward that is owned by President Obama. I think one of the noticeable things in the last year is that this has been totally delegated. You haven't seen the president convene his principles, have one session, have two sessions, have three sessions saying, how do we move this forward? What have we done? What hasn't worked? What new creative thinking can we have there?
What about bringing in pro-Western or those countries, Arab countries that support the United States in this process? Who is stepping forward, and are they helping?
Well, I think the Arab governments are still in a period of shock, actually, because they had a certain set of expectations with the Obama administration, and they're getting another. When they had President Bush, they were actually in a panic, and they recognized that the United States was planning to go to war with Iraq. They were desperate to convince President Bush that he needed to free Palestine before he occupied Iraq. And so they did a number of things. There was the Arab Peace Initiative, which was huge. Crown Prince Abdullah, he was Crown Prince at the time, he's king now of Saudi Arabia, traveled to Crawford and actually had a picture book with him in which he sat with President Bush and showed him pictures from the occupied Palestinian territory. There were a number of attempts to try to convince the administration to actually free Palestinians before he went to war with Iraq. Now, with President Obama, they thought that they actually had everything they needed. President Obama articulated the end goals that they wanted. And so they assumed that the United States was going to be handling this, and they effectively sat back. When Obama asked them to do the things that Bush asked them to do, they rejected it, they refused, but now they haven't been able to articulate what they want to do instead. They're still confused as to how to respond to an administration that articulates the same goals they have, but implements the policies of the previous administration.
That's interesting. Well, I'm wondering whether the U.S. is doing enough to try to support, or whether Israel might be doing enough to support Mahmoud Abbas, because, of course, that's believed that the Palestinian Authority is far better than having to deal with Hamas.
I would question why on earth one would expect Israel to support Mahmoud Abbas or Mahmoud Abbas to do things to help Israel. And I think when we look at it that way, we're missing the key thing here. Israelis and Palestinians are in an adversarial relationship. They are in a struggle over land, over resources, over how the world views them, over what has happened in history and what will happen in the future. Hopefully, that struggle will be played out in the realms of diplomacy, negotiations, and in the international arena, not using violence. But Israel doesn't see the same goal in mind as Abbas has, a Palestinian state on the 67 lines with Jerusalem as its capital, etc. So there's no real shared interest, and that's part of the problem, that we're looking at this in a way where we're missing the real nature of the Israeli-Palestinian relationship, and that's part of the continuation of the failed policies that unfortunately this administration has promoted.
All right, Amjad, I have to give you the last word, and you've got about 25 seconds here. What does the future really portend?
Well, I think that if we've seen anything from the Obama administration and from his campaign, is that when things don't work, when things fail, he recognizes that and he makes major adjustments and moves the ship forward. So I think that this is a major reassessment period for the administration. They can either continue trying to implement the same old policy, and they're going to end up pretty much probably the same place Bush ended up, or they're going to implement a new policy. I'm confident that the president's going to actually articulate a new direction.
Amjad Atallah, Daniel Levy. Thank you both.
Thank you.